At 10 minutes before 6 o'clock this morning, the ground underneath one of the most beautiful cities in Europe came alive, and more than 1 million people were thrown awake by a sound that did not come from the sky or the street, but from directly beneath their beds. A magnitude 4.4 earthquake had just struck Italy's supervolcano, Campi Flegrei, the vast hidden caldera that the western edge of Naples is not built near, but built inside. By the cold standards of seismology, it was a moderate event. It collapsed no apartment block, it killed no one. And yet within hours, mayors were closing schools, structural engineers were on the record using language that sounded like a casualty forecast, and people who have lived their whole lives on this volcano were describing themselves, in their own words, as absolutely terrified. So why did a moderate earthquake send an entire country into something close to panic? The answer is not the volcano. The answer is everything the earthquake exposed. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. 50 minutes before 6. At 10 minutes before 6 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, May 21st, 2026, the ground underneath the western edge of Naples, Italy moved. It did not creep. The way the ground in this particular place has been creeping for years, it snapped. And for the better part of a minute, more than 1 million people felt the floor of their world come alive beneath them. Most of them were still in bed. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and we will come back to it, because the time on the clock is part of why this story landed the way it did. But hold that image for a moment. It is just before 6 in the morning. The light is barely up over the Gulf of Naples, and in towns with names like Pozzuoli and Boccoli and Quarto and Monte di Procida, people are jolted out of sleep by a sound first, and then by motion. They describe the sound the same way, over and over, in account after account. A boom, a roar, a long, low growl that did not come from outside the building but from underneath it. One person said it was like a giant sneeze. Another said it had been years since they felt anything that intense. And then the shaking arrived, and it did not stop quickly. It was long. People kept waiting for it to end, and it kept not ending. This was a magnitude 4.4 earthquake. And if you are listening to that number and thinking 4.4, that is not a large earthquake, that is a moderate earthquake at best, then you are technically correct, and you are also missing the entire point of why we are here tonight. Because the size of this earthquake is almost the least interesting thing about it. What matters is where it happened, and how shallow it was, and what sits directly on top of it, and what it exposed about how unprepared one of the most beautiful and most dangerous cities in Europe really is. What matters is that this earthquake did not happen on some empty fault line in the middle of an ocean. It happened on a volcano. It happened on Campi Flegrei. If that name does not mean anything to you yet, it will by the end of this. Campi Flegrei is the volcano that does not look like a volcano. There is no postcard cone, no snow-capped peak, no single mountain you can point at. Instead, there is a sprawling, low, broken caldera, a vast collapsed crater more than 12 kilometers across, and the western neighborhoods of Naples are not near it. They are inside it. 500,000 people live inside the highest hazard zone of an active volcanic system, and the greater Naples metropolitan area, all of it sitting in the shadow of this thing, holds more than 6 million people. This is not a volcano in a remote wilderness that erupts and inconveniences a few hikers. This is a volcano with a city built into its mouth, and on the morning of May 21st, that volcano produced the first earthquake of magnitude 4 or greater that it had generated all year. 2025 had been a loud, restless, frightening year for Campi Flegrei. 2026, by comparison, had been quieter. There had been smaller tremors, the constant background grumble that everyone living there has learned to live with, but nothing of this size. The early months of the year had felt almost like a pause, and then, at 50 minutes before 6 in the morning, the pause ended, and it ended with a shock strong enough that people having coffee kilometers away watched the liquid in the cup tremble like water in a jacuzzi. Before we go down into the ground, I want you to understand the scale of what we are talking about when we say Naples, because the word city does not really capture it. Naples and its surrounding metropolitan area is one of the most densely populated places in all of Europe. People are packed in, building against building, neighbourhood folded into neighbourhood, along a coastline that is by any measure one of the most beautiful in the world. The Bay of Naples has drawn people for thousands of years, drawn the Greeks and the Romans, drawn emperors who built their villas along this coast, and the reason it is so beautiful is, in a grim irony, the same reason it is so dangerous. The drama of the landscape, the curve of the bays, the islands, the steaming ground, the rich volcanic soil that makes everything grow, all of it is volcanic. The beauty and the danger are the same geology, and on the western side of this metropolis sits Campi Flegrei, and on the eastern side, across the bay, sits the more famous threat, Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that buried Pompeii. Naples is a city bracketed by volcanoes, built on volcanic rock, fed by volcanic soil, and home to millions of people who have made an uneasy, centuries-long peace with that fact. Most days the peace holds. The morning of May 21st was one of the days it did not, and the timing of the earthquake, the specific hour on the clock, is something I want you to hold on to because it threads through everything that follows. 50 minutes before 6 in the morning, not the middle of a working day, when people are scattered across offices and streets and schools and cars, distributed across the whole city in a way that, in an earthquake, actually saves lives. 50 minutes before 6 in the morning is close to the worst possible hour. It is the hour when the population is at its most concentrated indoors, when families are gathered under single roofs, when people are asleep in the upper floors of old buildings, slow to wake, slow to react, slow to get out. Every emergency planner who thinks about earthquake risk thinks about the hour of the day, because the same magnitude earthquake can produce wildly different death tolls depending on where the population is when it strikes. The May 21st earthquake struck at an hour when nearly everyone was inside, in bed, in exactly the place an earthquake is most dangerous to be. It did not, this time, do real harm, but the hour it chose is part of why the fear was so immediate and so total. People did not just feel an earthquake. They felt an earthquake while lying defenseless in the dark, in the building, on the floor, in the exact circumstance their instincts know to be the most dangerous. So here is the question that should be sitting in your mind already, the question this entire video is built around. Why did a moderate earthquake, on a volcano that scientists insist is not about to erupt, send an entire country into something close to panic? Why are mayors closing schools? Why are structural engineers giving interviews with numbers that sound like body counts? Why did people who have lived their whole lives on top of this thing wake up on May 21st and describe themselves, in their own words, as absolutely terrified? The earthquake itself did not kill anyone. It did not collapse a single apartment block. By the cold standards of seismology, it was a minor event. And yet the reaction was anything but minor. To understand that gap, the gap between the size of the shock and the size of the fear, we have to go down, into the ground, into the Caldera, and into a slow-motion crisis that has been building underneath Naples for a very long time. We have to start with what actually happened in those 60 seconds, and we have to start with the single strangest detail of the entire event, the detail that even seasoned observers found unusual. This earthquake came from the wrong place. Part 2. The wrong place. Let me tell you what was supposed to happen, in the sense of what normally happens when Campi Flegrei produces a strong earthquake, and then let me tell you what actually happened on May 21st, because the difference between those two things is the thread we're going to follow for the next 2 hours. Campi Flegrei is not a quiet volcano. It produces earthquakes constantly. In a single week earlier this year, in late February and early March, the monitoring network recorded somewhere around 70 earthquakes, one after another, a near-continuous rattle. Most of them are tiny, far too small for anyone to feel, registered only by instruments. But the Caldera does, from time to time, produce the bigger ones, the ones in the magnitude 3 range, the magnitude 4 range, and here is the pattern. When Campi Flegrei produces a strong earthquake, it almost always produces it on land. The seismicity clusters in the central part of the Caldera, underneath the town of Pozzuoli, around a steaming, hissing crater called the Solfatara, and over toward an area called Agnano. That central zone is the heart of the volcano. It is where the ground has been rising fastest. It is where the strain concentrates. It is, if you want to think of it that way, the part of the Caldera that everyone is watching most closely, the part that is most densely covered with instruments, the part scientists understand best. The earthquake on May 21st did not come from there. It came from the water. The epicenter, the point on the surface directly above where the rock actually broke, was located offshore. It was out in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, the curved bay of water tucked into the larger Gulf of Naples, off the coast of the town of Pozzuoli, near a young volcanic hill called Monte Nuovo. The strongest earthquake this volcano had generated in months did not come from the on-land core that everyone monitors. It came from the submarine western flank of the Caldera, from underneath the sea. And that, to people who study this volcano, is unusual. It is not unheard of, and we'll get to why in a moment, but it is not the system's normal behaviour. A magnitude 4.4 from out in the water, off Pozzuoli, is the Caldera doing something slightly outside its usual script. Now, why does that matter? It matters for two reasons, and they are both worth slowing down for. The first reason is purely about who felt it and how widely. Think about how earthquake energy spreads. When the rock breaks, the energy radiates outward in every direction, like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond, except the pond is solid rock, and the ripples are seismic waves. If the break happens on land, in the central caldera, the strongest shaking is concentrated in a fairly tight zone around that central point, around Pozzuoli and Solfatara. People there feel it hard, people further away feel it less. But when the break happens offshore in the water, the geometry changes. The energy spreads out across a broad arc of coastline rather than hammering one inland spot. And that is exactly what the felt reports describe. This earthquake was not felt as a sharp, localized jolt around Pozzuoli. It was felt across the entire caldera, through much of the area around Mount Vesuvius on the other side of Naples, all the way out on the island of Ischia and inland to the region of Caserta. Inside the city of Naples itself, it was felt clearly in neighbourhood after neighbourhood, from Fuorigrotta and Bagnoli near the coast, up through Vomero and Posillipo and Arenella into the hospital district. People reported their beds shaking who do not live anywhere near the caldera. The offshore location is a large part of why the fear spread so far, so fast. The earthquake did not just shake the people who live on the volcano, it shook the whole city, and it made everyone, all 6 million of them, suddenly aware of what is underneath their feet. The second reason the location matters is harder and more uncomfortable, and it is the reason I want you to keep the word offshore in your mind for the rest of this video. Because this was not the first time. Cast your memory back to the summer of 2025. On the 30th of June, 2025, Campi Flegrei produced a magnitude 4.6 earthquake. That event was the strongest earthquake this volcano had generated in roughly 40 years. It was strong enough to crack walls, strong enough to collapse the ridge of a small islet called Penata, strong enough that Italy's national railway operator warned of delays of up to 2 hours. And that earthquake, the magnitude 4.6, the strongest in 4 decades, was also offshore. It was also out in the water, near Pozzuoli. So now look at the pattern. The two largest earthquakes of this entire crisis, the 4.6 of June 2025 and the 4.4 of May 2026, did not come from the on-land core. They came from the same offshore, western submarine sector. 2 data points is not a trend. I want to be careful here, and the channel is always careful here, because 2 events is a thin basis for a sweeping conclusion. But 2 data points is absolutely enough to be a question. And the question is this: is the most energetic strain release of this crisis quietly migrating away from the part of the caldera that everyone monitors most closely and out into the water, into the part that is harder to instrument, harder to see, and less intuitively understood? Let me sit a little longer with why the offshore origin is so genuinely disorienting to the people who study this, because it goes deeper than a felt area map. A caldera like Campi Flegrei is not a single point. It is a vast broken structure, a collapsed crater rimmed and flawed by faults, by old fracture systems, by the scars of every collapse and every resurgence in its long history. When the caldera floor is pushed upward by the pressure below, that upward push does not get absorbed evenly. It gets taken up along those faults, along those lines of weakness, and the earthquakes happen where the weakest, most loaded structures finally give. For years, the structures giving way have been, overwhelmingly, the ones under the central caldera, under Pozzuoli and the Solfatara. That is where the deformation has been measured as greatest, and that is, sensibly, where the strongest shaking has been expected. The mental model, the working picture in everyone's head, has been a central engine, with the strain radiating out from a known core. the May 21st earthquake and the June 2025 earthquake before it do not fit that model cleanly. They suggest that the western offshore structures, the faults out under the Gulf of Pozzuoli near Boccoli and Monte Nuovo, are now capable of producing the system's largest events, and a model that no longer cleanly predicts where the biggest earthquakes will come from is a model that has lost some of its power to reassure. There is also a human dimension to the offshore origin that is easy to miss. When an earthquake strikes a population, the first instinct, the immediate cognitive act, is to locate it. Where was that? People orient themselves toward a danger by placing it, and on May 21st, the placing went wrong, or at least went strange. People deep inside Naples, kilometers from any part of the Caldera anyone thinks about day to day, felt strong shaking and could not immediately reconcile it. The man with the coffee cup trembling like a jacuzzi was, by his own account, surprised that the shaking could reach him at all. People reported beds shaking in neighborhoods that do not consider themselves volcano towns. That dislocation, the gap between where people thought the danger lived and where the shaking actually reached, is part of what made the morning so frightening. The volcano did not behave the way the city's mental map said it should. It reached further, from a stranger direction than the map predicted, and a danger that exceeds your mental map of it is, almost by definition, a danger you feel you have lost a measure of control over. Hold that question. We are going to come back to it, because it sits very close to the core mystery of this whole story. But before we can understand why an offshore earthquake is unsettling, we have to understand the second defining feature of the May 21st event. It was not just in the wrong place, it was also extremely shallow. And shallow when it comes to earthquakes is a word that does a lot of quiet, dangerous work. Part 3. 3 kilometers down. When the Vesuvius Observatory, the local arm of Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, finally published the official parameters of the May 21st earthquake, one number told you almost everything you needed to know about why the shaking felt so violent. The depth. The earthquake originated about 3.1 kilometers below the surface, that is roughly 1.9 miles. In the world of earthquakes, that is shallow, that is very shallow, and shallow is the difference between an earthquake you read about and an earthquake you feel in your teeth. Here is the physics, told simply, because this is the kind of thing that sounds technical, but is actually intuitive once you picture it. The energy released by an earthquake has to travel from the point where the rock breaks, up through the crust, to reach the surface where people are standing. Rock is not a perfect conductor of that energy. As the seismic waves travel, they spread out, and they lose intensity, and they get absorbed by the kilometers of rock they pass through. So imagine 2 earthquakes of exactly the same magnitude, the same total energy. One of them happens 60 kilometers deep, the other happens 3 kilometers deep. The deep one, by the time its energy claws its way up 60 kilometers of rock to the surface, has been spread thin and softened. It might be barely felt. The shallow one, the one only 3 kilometers down, delivers almost its full violence directly into the ground people are standing on. There is hardly any rock in between to absorb it. The energy arrives concentrated, sharp and close. This is why a magnitude 4.4 can feel, to the people living through it, far larger than the number suggests. A shallow magnitude 4.4 can produce shaking that rivals a deeper earthquake, a full magnitude step bigger. And remember, the magnitude scale is logarithmic, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot, so let me make it concrete. Each whole step up the magnitude scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. A magnitude 5 is not a little bigger than a magnitude 4. It releases about 32 times the energy. So when a shallow magnitude 4.4 manages to feel like something noticeably larger, that is not people exaggerating. That is the physics of depth doing exactly what the physics of depth does. The earthquake was small on paper and big in the body, and the reason was those 3 kilometers. Combine the 2 features now. Combine the offshore location with the shallow depth, and you have the full explanation for the felt reports. Shallow energy, radiating out from a point in the water, spreading across a broad coastal arc instead of hammering one inland zone. That is a recipe for an earthquake that is felt by millions of people, hard simultaneously, across an entire metropolitan region at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning. It is a recipe for a city waking up all at once, in the dark, to the same terrifying question. There is one more piece of the May 21st event itself that we have not properly examined, and it matters, because it tells you the morning was not a single shock but a process. The magnitude 4.4 at 10 minutes before 6 was not isolated. It was the leading event of a seismic swarm. Before it, shortly after midnight, there had already been a magnitude 1.3. After it, the sequence continued. 3 minutes after the main shock, at 53 minutes past 5, a magnitude 1.2. 7 minutes after the main shock, at 57 minutes past 5, a magnitude 2.1. And between and around those named events, numerous smaller micro-earthquakes, the kind too small to be felt but real, registered by the instruments. Hours later, the ground at the Caldera was reported to be still trembling. The National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology confirmed it directly. A new seismic swarm was in progress. Now, why does the swarm framing matter, beyond simply adding more numbers? It matters because of what it does to the people experiencing it, and because of what it leaves genuinely unresolved. A single, sharp earthquake, however frightening, has a shape. It happens, it ends, and on some level the body understands it is over. A swarm has no such shape. A swarm is a sequence, an ongoing thing, the ground speaking again and again over hours, and every small aftershock carries the same unanswerable question. Is this the sequence winding down, the system settling after its release? Or is this the sequence building towards something larger, the small shocks a prelude rather than an epilogue? In the moment, living through it, you cannot know. The 4.4 could be the main event, with the smaller shocks the ordinary tail of aftershocks that follows any significant earthquake. Or the 4.4 could, in principle, be a foreshock, a warning crack before a larger rupture. The overwhelming statistical likelihood in any earthquake sequence is that the largest event has already happened, and what follows is the decaying aftershock tail. But likelihood is not certainty, and you cannot tell which kind of sequence you're in until it is over. So the people of Naples spent not 60 seconds, but the whole morning, and beyond, inside that uncertainty, feeling the ground tremble, and not knowing which story they were in. That sustained, unresolved trembling is part of why the fear did not simply spike and fade. The volcano did not let them have a clean ending. And the depth detail, those 3.1 kilometers, deserves one more moment, because it interacts with the swarm in a way worth naming. Shallow earthquakes, as we said, deliver their energy with less rock to soften it. But shallow earthquakes also tend to be felt as sharper, more sudden, more violent in their onset, because the high-frequency content of the shaking, the part that rattles and jolts rather than rolls, survives better over a short travel path. People describe the May 21st shock as loud, as a boom, as a roar. That description is the signature of a shallow source. The sound, in fact, the actual audible boom that residents reported, is shallow seismic energy coupling into the air, the ground itself acting as a vast speaker. A deep earthquake of the same magnitude would more likely be felt as a longer, gentler roll, and would be far less likely to produce that visceral, terrifying boom. The shallowness did not just make the earthquake felt more widely, it made it felt more frighteningly, gave it a sound, gave it the quality of an explosion. And on a volcano, an underground boom is the most psychologically loaded sound there is. And here is where the story takes a turn that I genuinely did not expect when I started looking into this, and that I think is one of the most quietly revealing parts of the whole event. Because once that city woke up, all 6 million of them, jolted out of bed by a long, loud, shallow shock. They did what people in Naples have been trained to do. They have lived with this volcano and its tremors for years. They know the drill. When the ground moves, you check the official sources. You go to the website of the monitoring agency, the people whose entire job is to watch this volcano 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you find out what just happened. Where was it? How big was it? Is it over? And for a long, frightening stretch of time, on the morning of May 21st, there was nothing there. Think about what that means. The Italian monitoring system for this volcano is genuinely world-class. We are going to spend real time on it later in this video because it deserves it. The National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology operates one of the most sophisticated real-time volcano monitoring networks anywhere on the planet. Instruments measuring the rise and fall of the ground to the millimeter, seismometers logging every crackle in the crust, sensors tracking gravity, tracking the chemistry of the gases hissing out of the solfatara, tracking the temperature and the composition of the groundwater. The data flows in continuously, in real time. And yet, after a magnitude 4.4 earthquake that was felt by millions of people, there was a window, a meaningful stretch of minutes, where the public-facing earthquake databases simply had no event listed. Not the Italian database, not the international ones, like the United States Geological Survey. People who had just been physically shaken awake were searching, refreshing, searching again, and finding silence. Now, I want to be fair and grounded about why that happens, because the honest explanation matters, and we are not in the business of manufacturing a villain. When an earthquake happens, the raw signal hits the seismometers instantly, yes. But turning that raw signal into a published, located, sized event takes processing. Computers and analysts have to take the squiggles from dozens of stations and triangulate them into a single point, a single depth, a single magnitude. The first automatic solution is often rough. It gets revised. In fact, that is exactly what we saw here. The United States Geological Survey initially placed this earthquake in a slightly different spot, and at a smaller magnitude, somewhere around 4.1, a preliminary number that was expected to be corrected upward and relocated as more data came in. That is not incompetence. That is just how the sausage gets made. Seismology in the first 10 minutes after an event is always a little blurry. But here is the thing. Understanding why the delay happened does not erase what the delay felt like. Put yourself in that apartment in Pozzuoli. It is dark. You have just been thrown awake by a roar and a minute of shaking. Your children are scared. Your neighbour is in the hallway. And the one tool you have been told to rely on, the official word from the people who watch the volcano, is showing you a blank space where the answer should be. That silence, that gap between feeling the catastrophe and being able to name it, became its own source of terror on May 21st. It is, in a strange way, part of the earthquake. And it fed something else, something we will deal with honestly later, which is the suspicion, the whispered theory, that the silence was not a technical lag at all, but a deliberate decision to keep people calm. We will come back to that, and we will take it seriously, and we will also explain what the evidence actually says. For now, just hold on to the image. A whole city, awake, shaking, asking the same question into the dark and for a while getting no reply. Because to understand why that question carried so much fear, we now have to leave the morning of May 21st behind and go back in time and go underground and look at the slow, strange, decades-long process that set the stage for all of it. We have to talk about the breathing ground. Part 4. The breathing ground. There is a word for what Campi Flegrei does, and it is one of the most unsettling words in all of geology, because it describes the ground itself behaving like something alive. The word is bradyseism. It comes from Greek roots that mean, roughly, slow movement, and what it describes is this. The floor of the Caldera, the broad collapsed crater that the western neighbourhoods of Naples are built inside, does not stay still. It rises, and it falls. Slowly, over years and decades, the entire ground surface inflates and deflates, like the chest of some enormous sleeping thing drawing breath. That is not a metaphor I am reaching for to be dramatic. It is the literal observed behaviour of the land. The ground breathes, and right now it is breathing in. It has been breathing in this time for a long time. The caldera is in a phase of inflation, of uplift, that has been going on and accelerating for years. The point where the ground rises the most, the very centre of this slow swelling, is at a place called Rione Terra, an ancient promontory in the heart of Pozzuoli. And the numbers there are genuinely staggering when you sit with them. By the middle of 2025, the total uplift at Rione Terra during this modern crisis had reached roughly 148 centimetres. Let me convert that for you. That is nearly 5 feet. The ground in the centre of Pozzuoli has risen by close to a human height. Streets, buildings, the harbour, the people, all of it lifted, slowly, relentlessly, by the pressure of whatever is happening below. And a significant chunk of that, around 29.5 centimetres, nearly a foot, accumulated just since the start of 2024. This is not ancient history. This is happening now, this year, under the feet of people going to work. So what is doing the lifting? This is the central scientific question of the entire Campi Flegrei crisis, and it is the question that everything else hangs on, so let me lay it out carefully and honestly, because the honest version is more interesting than the scary version, and also, as it happens, more useful. There are broadly two things that could be pushing the ground up. The first is magma. Molten rock, rising from the depths, physically inflating the system as it pushes toward the surface. That is the nightmare reading, because magma rising is the direct prelude to an eruption. The second possibility is hydrothermal. Not magma itself, but the gases and the superheated water driven off by magma that is sitting somewhere far below, not necessarily rising at all. Those hot gases and fluids migrate upward. They pressurize the rock, they heat it, they expand it, and they push the ground up without any molten rock going anywhere near the surface. And here is the genuinely important part, the part that the channel wants you to hear clearly. The mainstream scientific reading of the current crisis at Campi Flegrei leans toward the second explanation. The prevailing assessment, supported by detailed studies of this phase of unrest, is that what is happening is dominated by hydrothermal processes, gases and fluids pressurizing and fracturing the rock, rather than a fresh body of magma climbing toward the surface. And flowing directly from that assessment is the other thing the scientists keep saying, the thing that gets quoted less often than the scary parts. The conditions for an eruption, in the short term, do not exist. No monitoring agency is forecasting an imminent eruption. That is the honest, sober, mainstream position, and we are not going to bury it. Because it is true, and because pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of manufactured fear this channel refuses to traffic in. But, and this is a very large but, and it is the but that the entire rest of this video lives inside. The fact that the unrest is hydrothermal rather than magmatic does not make a magnitude 4.4 earthquake harmless. It does not even make it reassuring. Let me explain why, because this is the hinge of the whole story. The National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology has actually done the work of quantifying a relationship at this caldera. A relationship between how fast the ground is rising and how much the ground shakes. And the relationship is exactly what your intuition would tell you. More uplift produces more earthquakes and stronger ones. The two things are linked. When you push the roof of a caldera upward, you are bending and stressing a slab of solid rock. Rock does not bend gracefully forever. It bends and it stresses, and eventually in places it cracks. Every one of those cracks is an earthquake. So the earthquakes at Campi Flegrei are, in the standard reading, the brittle complaint of a caldera roof being slowly forced upward from below. The ground is rising. The rock above is fracturing to accommodate the rise, and the magnitude 4.4 on May 21st is simply what that fracturing sounds like when a particularly large piece of the roof lets go at once. I want to slow down on the difference between hydrothermal and magmatic unrest, because it is the most misunderstood idea in this entire subject, and getting it right is what separates honest fear from useless fear. Picture far below Campi Flegrei, a body of magma. It is there. Everyone agrees it is there. The debate has never been about whether magma exists under the caldera. The debate is about whether that magma is doing anything new. In the magmatic scenario, the magma itself is on the move, rising, pushing, intruding into new space closer to the surface, and that movement is what inflates the ground and breaks the rock. In the hydrothermal scenario, the magma is staying roughly where it is, but it is hot, and it is constantly releasing gases and heating the water in the rock above it. Those hot gases and that superheated water are what migrate upward, pressurizing the shallow rock, fracturing it, lifting it. The ground rises and the earthquakes happen, but the molten rock itself has not climbed. The prevailing scientific reading of the current Campi Flegrei crisis favours that second picture, and that is genuinely meaningful, because a system inflating from gas and fluid pressure is, in the immediate term, a less dangerous system than one inflating because magma is ascending toward the surface. But here is the trap, the subtle and important trap. People hear hydrothermal and they relax, as though hydrothermal means harmless. It does not. Hydrothermal means the immediate driver is not ascending magma. It does not mean the system is safe, and it does not mean the system is stable, and it absolutely does not mean the situation cannot escalate. A hydrothermal system can pressurize further, it can heat further, it can build toward exactly the kind of steam-driven failure we are about to discuss. And critically, The assessment that the unrest is currently hydrothermal is a snapshot, not a guarantee about the future. Volcanic systems can transition. The honest scientific position is not, the unrest is hydrothermal, therefore relax. The honest position is the unrest currently appears hydrothermal, which is somewhat less alarming than the alternative, and the situation requires constant vigilant monitoring precisely because hydrothermal systems are not static, and the transition to something worse does not always announce itself loudly. And there is a measurement that makes the link between the breathing ground and the shaking ground concrete, that turns it from an abstraction into a number. The monitoring scientists have studied the relationship between the rate of uplift and the rate of seismicity at this caldera, and what they found is a quantifiable coupling. When the ground rises faster, the caldera produces more earthquakes, and it produces stronger ones. There were periods in the autumn of 2025 when the uplift rate at the centre of the caldera reached around 25 millimeters a month, 2.5 centimeters of rise every month, and those faster periods came with more intense seismicity. Since the middle of December 2025, that rate eased somewhat, settling to something closer to 15 millimeters a month, give or take a few. So the rate is not constant, it surges and it slackens. But across all of it, the underlying coupling holds. The faster the ground breathes in, the more the rock above it cracks. The May 21st earthquake did not appear from nowhere. It appeared from a caldera that has been inflating at varying speed for years, and the magnitude 4.4 is simply the loudest single expression, so far this year, of a roof of rock being slowly and continuously forced upward. Which brings us to the specific scenario that genuinely does worry the scientists, the one that connects the slow breathing of the ground directly to the fear in the streets on May 21st. It is not primarily a giant magmatic eruption, it is something called a phreatic eruption, and you need to understand what that is because it is the quiet monster at the centre of this entire story. A phreatic eruption is a steam explosion. That is the simplest way to say it. It does not require fresh magma to reach the surface. It does not require molten rock to climb up a conduit in the way a classic eruption does. All a phreatic eruption requires is for hot rock, or hot fluids, to flash a body of groundwater into steam, fast enough and violently enough to fracture and blast away the rock sitting on top of it. Water turning to steam expands enormously, hundreds of times its liquid volume, almost instantly. If that happens in a confined space underground, it is functionally a bomb. And the trigger does not have to be magma doing anything new. It just has to be heat-meeting water in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now connect that to Campi Flegrei specifically. What does this caldera have? It has increased hydrothermal activity. It has rising ground temperatures. It has renewed, accelerating uplift. And it has volcanic gas emissions so persistent and so strong that on occasion those gases have accumulated inside people's homes and have forced authorities to close schools, not because of shaking, but because of the air. Every single ingredient for a phreatic eruption is present at this caldera, right now. Hot rock, hot fluids, abundant groundwater, confined fracture systems, and here is the terrifying property of a phreatic eruption, the property that makes it the thing scientists lose sleep over. Because it does not depend on magma ascending, it does not necessarily produce the warning signs that a monitoring network is built to catch. A classic magmatic eruption announces itself. The magma climbing toward the surface triggers a recognizable crescendo of earthquakes, a recognizable pattern of ground deformation, a recognizable shift in gas chemistry. The network sees it coming. A phreatic eruption can skip all of that. It can happen with little or no warning at all. The precursors everyone is counting on may simply never appear. And a strong, shallow earthquake, like the one on May 21st, is not a neutral bystander to that process. A strong, shallow shock can, in principle, open new fracture pathways or widen existing ones, giving the pressurized gas and steam below new routes upward. It can change the plumbing. That is precisely why a monitoring agency does not look at a magnitude 4.4 at this caldera and shrug. They look at it and they think about fracture networks, and steam, and the one type of eruption that does not send a warning. The breathing ground produced this earthquake, and the breathing ground is connected directly to the one scenario that could turn this from a story about fear into a story about catastrophe, without giving anyone the days of notice they are assuming they will get. It is worth painting the phreatic eruption in a little more detail, because it is the specific mechanism that connects a seemingly modest earthquake to a genuinely serious hazard, and the connection is not obvious until you see it. Imagine, a kilometre or two beneath the surface of the caldera, a body of rock that is hot and saturated with water and full of pressurized gas working its way up from the magma far below. That system is held in a kind of balance. The rock above acts as a lid, a confining seal, and as long as the lid holds, the pressurized steam and gas stay trapped, building but contained. The danger comes from anything that suddenly breaks the seal, and a strong, shallow earthquake is exactly the kind of thing that can break a seal. When the ground fractures, when a magnitude 4.4 snaps a piece of the caldera roof, it can open new cracks or widen existing ones, and those cracks are pathways. If a pathway suddenly connects the pressurized steam-charged rock below to the lower pressure world above, the trapped water can flash to steam almost instantaneously. Water turning to steam expands by a factor of well over 1,000. That expansion, in a confined space, is an explosion, and it can blast the overlying rock outward and upward with no magma having moved at all. This is why monitoring scientists do not look at a strong shallow earthquake on this caldera as a neutral event. The earthquake is not just a symptom of the unrest. It is potentially a trigger, a thing that can modify the plumbing of a pressurized hydrothermal system in an instant. The May 21st earthquake, as far as anyone can tell, did not do that. The system did not fail, but the mechanism by which it could have is not exotic. It is exactly the interaction between a shallow earthquake and a pressurized hydrothermal system that the science describes, and it is the reason the 4.4 was treated as a serious event and not a statistical footnote. And I want to underline the warning problem one more time, because it is the single most important takeaway about the phreatic scenario. With a classic magmatic eruption, the system tends to give notice. Magma climbing toward the surface displaces rock, and that displacement shows up as a recognizable escalating pattern, more earthquakes, accelerating ground deformation, shifts in the chemistry of the escaping gas, a crescendo that trained monitors can recognize and that has, at volcanoes around the world, allowed timely evacuations. The phreatic eruption can skip that crescendo. Because it does not depend on magma ascending, it may not produce the orderly, escalating, days-long warning sequence that the entire evacuation plan implicitly is built to rely on. It can be fast, it can be close to silent, right up until it is not, and that is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath the reassuring official line that an eruption is not imminent. That line is true, and it refers mostly to the magmatic scenario, the big, slow, detectable one. The phreatic scenario is a different animal, and its defining feature is precisely that it can defeat the assumption of warning. When you put that together with everything else, the fragile buildings, the failing evacuation, the unready roads, you see why the people of Naples cannot simply be told to relax. The plan assumes a warning. The most plausible sudden hazard is the one that may not send one. But even the phreatic scenario, frightening as it is still a story about the volcano. And here is the thing I most want you to take away from this entire video. The volcano on May 21st is not actually the most dangerous character in the story. To see the real danger, the danger that explains the genuine, rational panic in the streets, we have to stop looking down at the caldera and start looking around at the city. We have to talk about the buildings. Part 5. The city made of dust. Here is a fact that, once you understand it, completely reframes the panic on the morning of May 21st and explains why a moderate earthquake produced a reaction that looked, to outsiders, wildly out of proportion. The danger at Campi Flegrei has two completely separate components, and people constantly confuse them. The first component is what the volcano does, how big the earthquakes are, whether the unrest is hydrothermal or magmatic, whether an eruption is coming. We have spent the first half of this video on that component, and the honest summary is that the scientists are watching it intensely, and they are not right now forecasting an eruption. The second component is something else entirely. The second component is what the city can survive, and the second component is far, far more frightening than the first. Let me put it as plainly as I can. An earthquake does not by itself kill people. Shaking ground does not kill people. Buildings kill people. The entire lethality of an earthquake, the entire question of whether a given shock produces 0 deaths or produces a mass casualty event comes down to one thing. What is the building stock made of, and how does it respond when the ground moves? And the building stock of Naples and the towns of the Phlegreian fields is, in a word that I am choosing carefully, vulnerable. Much of the construction in this region, in Naples proper, and in the Phlegreian towns like Pozzuoli and Boccoli, is old, and it is built in a style called unreinforced masonry. You need to understand what that means, because it is the crux of everything. Unreinforced masonry means walls built of stone, or of brick, or of tufa, the soft volcanic rock that is everywhere in this region, stacked and bonded together with mortar, and crucially, with no internal skeleton of steel to hold it together when it is shaken. A modern earthquake-resistant building has a frame, a cage of reinforced concrete or steel, and the structure flexes with the shaking and stays standing. An unreinforced masonry building has no cage. It is, structurally, a careful stack of heavy pieces held together by the grip of old mortar, and when you shake a careful stack of heavy pieces side to side hard, for a long time, the stack comes apart. The walls crack. The walls separate from the floors lose their support and pancake down. The whole thing fails, and it fails fast, and it fails on top of whoever is inside. Now here is the part that genuinely chilled me when I read it, and it is the reason structural engineers in this region give interviews using numbers that sound less like engineering, and more like a casualty forecast. Engineers and structural specialists looking at Naples have warned, openly and on the record, that an earthquake in the magnitude 5.1 range could produce casualties on a catastrophic scale. Hundreds of thousands of people. Sit with that. Hundreds of thousands. And the reason is not that a magnitude 5.1 is some monstrous rare planet-shaking event. By the standards of the world's great faults, a magnitude 5.1 is unremarkable. It happens somewhere on Earth all the time. The reason the number is so horrifying in this specific place is entirely about the buildings. It is because so much of the housing stock would not survive that level of shaking. The catastrophe is not written into the geology, it is written into the masonry. And we have unfortunately a recent real-world demonstration of exactly this principle. I talked not long ago about earthquakes elsewhere in the world where a relatively moderate shock, something in the low magnitude 5 range, produced building collapses that surprised people. And the lesson there was the same lesson. It was never about the raw magnitude. It was about old, unreinforced masonry construction meeting ground motion it was never built to withstand. The buildings that come down in those events are the same kind of buildings that fill the historic hearts of Naples and Pozzuoli. This is not a hypothetical. It is a pattern we have watched play out, and the May 21st earthquake is a reminder that Naples is sitting inside that same pattern, waiting. There is a comparison worth making here, carefully, because it makes the building problem concrete rather than abstract. Around the world, in places with vulnerable construction, we have repeatedly seen earthquakes in the moderate range, earthquakes that would barely register as newsworthy in a region with modern construction, produce real building collapses and real casualties. The determining variable every single time is not the magnitude, it is the masonry. A modern, seismically engineered city can absorb a magnitude 5, even a magnitude 6, with broken windows and frayed nerves and very few deaths. An old city of unreinforced masonry can suffer collapses from a shock that an engineered city would shrug off. The earthquake does not change. The buildings change, and the buildings of Naples and the Phlegreian towns are in large part on the wrong side of that line. So when you hear a structural engineer warn about a magnitude 5.1, do not picture a monstrous, exotic event. Picture an earthquake that, in San Francisco or Tokyo or Wellington, would be a moderate, survivable jolt. Then picture that same moderate jolt arriving under a dense old city of tufa walls and powdered mortar, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning with everyone inside. That is the asymmetry. That is why the same number means something completely different here. The volcano sets the magnitude, the masonry sets the death toll, and the masonry in this case was set centuries ago, by builders who could not have imagined the question we are now forced to ask of their work. And it is worth being clear-eyed about why this cannot simply be fixed quickly, because the obvious response, just reinforce the buildings, runs into the same brutal realities as everything else in this story. Retrofitting an old masonry building to survive an earthquake is expensive, invasive, and slow. It often means people cannot live in the building while the work is done. Multiply that across a dense old city of hundreds of thousands of structures, many of them historically protected, many of them owned by families with no capacity to fund such work, and you have a task measured not in years but in generations, if it can be done at all. This is the same shape of problem as the failed depopulation of the red zone, the same shape as the unready roads. It is not that no one knows what the solution is. The engineers know, the volcanologists know, the solution is known. It is the execution, the cost, the politics, the sheer human difficulty of acting on what is known that has not happened. And the May 21st earthquake is, in a sense, a status report on all of that unfinished work. It arrived, it shook the city, and it found everything more or less as exposed as it was the day before. The May 21st earthquake was a magnitude 4.4. It was, mercifully, below the threshold where the masonry of Naples comes down in large numbers, but it was not harmless to the buildings, and the damage it did do is a preview, a small, legible preview of the mechanism that would operate at a larger scale in a larger event. The damage reports from May 21st describe falling plaster, they describe cracked walls, they describe small collapses, and they describe these things concentrated especially in the Pozzuoli area, closest to that offshore epicenter. There was a reported collapse of the arch of a structure called the Belvedere of Baia. There were failures along the rocky slopes and ridges around Pozzuoli. None of that killed anyone, but every cracked wall, every piece of fallen plaster, every small collapse is the masonry telling you, in a quiet voice, exactly how it behaves when the ground moves. And there is a detail in the structural assessments of the red zone, the highest hazard zone in Pozzuoli, that I cannot get out of my head. Structural engineers have described some of the homes there, homes packed tightly together, as buildings that are, in effect, leaning on each other, holding each other up. Because the mortar binding their own walls has degraded so badly, over so many decades, that it has the consistency of powder, pulverized dust. Buildings standing not because each one is sound, but because it has a neighbour to lean against. And those are the buildings that people sleep in, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, when the Caldera decides to move. It is worth understanding why the building stock of Naples and the Flegreian towns is the way it is, because it is not the result of carelessness exactly. It is the result of history and density, and the simple fact that people have been building here, continuously, for a very, very long time. This is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions in Europe. Pozzuoli was a major Roman port. The towns of the Phlegreian fields have layers of construction stacked on layers of construction, generation upon generation, and a great deal of the housing that people live in today was built in eras with no concept of seismic engineering, often using the soft, light, workable volcanic tufa that the region produces in abundance. Tufa is wonderful to build with. It is easy to cut, it insulates well, it is right there, it is also not steel. A wall of tufa blocks bound with lime mortar is structurally exactly the kind of unreinforced masonry that performs worst under earthquake shaking, and once a city is built, it does not get rebuilt. People do not tear down the family home because an engineer has concerns. They live in it, they pass it down. The vulnerability accumulates quietly across centuries until a morning like May 21st arrives, and the whole accumulated fragility is suddenly the only thing anyone can think about. Now, let me explain, mechanically, what actually happens to one of these buildings when the ground shakes, because the mechanism is the whole reason the magnitude 5.1 warning is so grim. When seismic waves pass through the ground, they move it back and forth, horizontally, rapidly. A building with a proper structural frame, a cage of reinforced concrete or steel, responds to that by swaying as a single connected unit. The frame holds the parts together, the building flexes, and it rides the shaking out. An unreinforced masonry building has no such cage. It is a collection of heavy walls and floors resting on those walls and a roof resting on top. When the ground throws it sideways, the walls, which are strong when you push down on them but weak when you push them sideways, begin to crack. The connections between walls fail. The connections between the walls and the floors fail, and once a floor loses the wall that was holding up its edge, that floor drops. It falls onto the floor below. That floor, now loaded with the weight of the one above, also drops. This is the pancake collapse, and it is the specific failure mode that kills people in earthquakes, because it converts the building into a stack of heavy horizontal slabs with very little survivable space left between them. That is what the engineers are visualizing when they talk about a magnitude 5.1. They are visualizing the pancaking, multiplied across a dense old city, multiplied by the fact that an earthquake before 6 in the morning catches people inside, in their beds, on exactly those floors. And the May 21st earthquake, at magnitude 4.4, gave a small, real, legible demonstration of the early stages of that mechanism. The damage was not catastrophic, and it is important to say that clearly nobody died, no apartment block came down. But look at the nature of the damage that was reported, because it is the mechanism in miniature. Falling plaster, that is the building surface shaken loose. Cracked walls, that is the masonry beginning to fail in exactly the sideways mode that matters. Small collapses, concentrated in Pozzuoli, closest to the offshore epicenter. The reported failure of the arch of the Belvedere of Baia, an old structure giving way at its weakest geometric point. Failures along the rocky ridges and slopes around Pozzuoli, the ground itself shedding material. Every one of those reports is the 4.4 version of the process. It is the same physics that, turned up by a magnitude or so, becomes the catastrophe. The May 21st earthquake did not destroy the city, but it showed the city, in cracks and dust and a fallen arch, precisely the language in which its own destruction would be written. So now reassemble the morning of May 21st with everything you now know. A shallow earthquake, from an unusual offshore direction, radiating energy across a broad arc of coastline into a city of more than 6 million people, of which 500,000 live in the highest hazard zone, and much of which is built of old, unreinforced, in places nearly powdered masonry. The people who woke up terrified that morning were not being irrational. They were not overreacting to a 4.4, they were reacting correctly to the thing the 4.4 reminded them of. They were reacting to the knowledge of what the next one, the slightly bigger one, would do to the walls around their beds. The fear was not about the earthquake that happened, it was about the earthquake the city is not built to survive, and it raises the obvious urgent question. If the buildings cannot be trusted, then surely the plan, the evacuation plan, the system designed to get people out before the worst happens, surely that can be trusted. Surely that is ready. It is not. And what we are about to look at is in some ways the most disturbing part of this entire story. Part 6. A plan that does not work. Every community that lives in the shadow of a known monitored volcanic hazard has, or is supposed to have, a plan. A plan for the moment the monitoring agency raises the alarm, the moment the data crosses a threshold and the order comes down to leave. Campi Flegrei has such a plan. The Italian civil protection system has developed evacuation planning for the red zone, the immediate Caldera area of highest hazard, and it operates a structured set of escalating alert levels designed to ratchet the response upward as the monitored data worsens. On paper, the plan exists. The problem, the deeply uncomfortable problem at the centre of this story, is the distance between the plan on paper and the plan as it would actually function on the worst morning of these people's lives. Start with the evacuation rehearsals. You cannot know whether an evacuation plan works until you test it, until you actually move people, or at least walk through the motions of moving people and see what breaks. Authorities in the Campi Flegrei area have in fact run evacuation rehearsals, and the reporting on those rehearsals is bleak. Participation has been very low. When the drills were held, large numbers of the people the drills were designed to protect simply did not take part. And it gets worse, because it is not only the public that has expressed doubt. Experienced scientists, people who have spent careers studying this caldera and this crisis, have openly questioned whether the evacuation plan would work at all, regardless of participation. When the experts whose job is to understand the hazard are telling you, on the record, that they do not believe the escape plan functions, that is not a small administrative footnote. That is a flashing red light. But the rehearsals are not even the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is physical. It is concrete and asphalt and steel. An evacuation fundamentally is a transportation problem. It is the problem of moving hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions if the panic spreads beyond the official red zone out of a danger area, quickly, along a finite number of roads. And the roads, the bridges, The highways that form the arteries of any Campi Flegrei evacuation are themselves not ready. They have not received the seismic upgrades they need. The reinforcement work required to make those critical routes survivable in a strong earthquake is projected to take until at least the end of 2027, and anyone who has watched large public infrastructure projects anywhere in the world knows how to read a projected completion date. The end of 2027 is the optimistic version. Large infrastructure projects routinely run over schedule. So the realistic reading is that the evacuation arteries of Naples will not be properly hardened against earthquakes for years yet. And then, layered on top of all of that, there is a detail that pushes the situation from worrying into something close to absurd. There have been reports that, because of ongoing construction work, parts of the road network, including routes that matter for evacuation, are already partially obstructed or closed. Not in some future earthquake scenario. Now. Today. The escape routes are, in places already narrowed by the very work that is meant, eventually to improve them. I want to dwell on the low participation in the evacuation rehearsals, because at first glance it looks like simple public apathy, and it is not. It is something more complicated and more human, and understanding it tells you something important about why a 4.4 caused the reaction it did. When you live, every day, on top of a volcano that produces a near constant background of small earthquakes, you face a genuine psychological problem. You cannot sustain maximum fear all day, every day, for years. The human mind will not do it, so people adapt. They normalize. The daily rattle becomes background noise, something you mention to a neighbor and then forget. That normalization is, in a sense, a survival mechanism, because the alternative, permanent terror, is not livable. But the same normalization that lets people get through the ordinary days is what makes an evacuation rehearsal feel abstract, unreal, not worth the disruption of a workday. It is hard to rehearse fleeing from a thing that has, in your lived daily experience, never actually forced you to flee. The low turnout at the drills is not people being stupid. It is people being human, caught between a danger that is genuinely real and a daily life that genuinely has to continue. And that is exactly why an event like May 21st is so significant. A strong, frightening, widely felt earthquake punches straight through the normalization. For one morning, the background noise becomes a roar, and the abstract becomes concrete, and people remember, all at once and with their whole bodies, what it is they have been living on top of. The fear that the rehearsals could not summon, the earthquake summoned in 60 seconds. There is also a brutal arithmetic to the evacuation problem that deserves to be spelled out, because it is the reason the experts are so openly pessimistic. The official evacuation planning is built around the red zone, the area of highest hazard, with its roughly 500,000 residents. 500,000 people is already an extraordinary number to move quickly. But the planning assumption that only the red zone would need to move is frankly optimistic to the point of being fragile. Think about the human reality. If an evacuation order goes out for the red zone, the people in the surrounding yellow zone, and the people in the wider city of Naples, 6 million of them, will not calmly stay put. They will see their neighbours leaving, they will hear the sirens, they will make their own judgment, and that judgment, for enormous numbers of them, will be that if it is bad enough to evacuate Pozzuoli, it is bad enough to leave Naples too. This is sometimes called the shadow evacuation, the spontaneous, unplanned flight of people outside the official zone, and it can dwarf the planned evacuation many times over. The roads were never designed to carry it. So when experienced scientists say the evacuation plan would not work, they are not only talking about blocked roads and unreinforced bridges. They are talking about the possibility that the true number of people trying to flee on the worst morning is not 500,000 but something several times larger, all converging on the same finite, fragile, partly obstructed network of roads at the same time. And here is where the seismic vulnerability of the roads themselves becomes the cruelest detail in the whole picture. We have said the critical routes will not be seismically upgraded until at least the end of 2027. But think about what that timeline actually means in combination with everything else. It means that, for the entire window between now and then, and realistically beyond it given how infrastructure schedules slip, the evacuation arteries are in the same vulnerable category as the housing. The bridges, the overpasses, the elevated sections of highway, the columns holding them up, are themselves susceptible to the very earthquake that would trigger the evacuation. So the failure is not just that buildings might collapse onto the roads, it is that the roads, The bridges, the structures of the escape route itself, might fail directly, shaken down by the same shock. The escape route and the hazard are not separate things. The escape route is made of the same vulnerable material, exposed to the same shaking on the same morning. Now connect every piece of this back to the earthquake on May 21st, because this is where the central thread of the whole video pulls tight. Picture the chain of events that the people of Naples are, consciously or not, terrified of. It does not begin with an eruption. That is the thing outsiders get wrong. It begins with an earthquake. A strong earthquake strikes, volcanic in origin or otherwise. It does not matter which. That earthquake hits the old, unreinforced, in places powdered masonry of Naples and the Phlegrean towns, and buildings come down. And those collapsed buildings do not just produce casualties where they fall, they produce rubble. Rubble in the streets, rubble across the roads, the same bridges, the same finite arteries that the entire evacuation depends on. And if a strong earthquake collapses buildings onto the evacuation routes, or brings down one of the many bridges and overpasses and columns along the main highway out, then the evacuation does not happen. It cannot happen. The plan to save everyone requires the roads, and the earthquake that triggers the need for the plan is the same earthquake that destroys the roads. There is something almost unbearable about the specific shape of this trap, and it is worth naming directly, because it is the thing that makes the Campi Flegrei situation different from a great many other volcanic hazards around the world. At most dangerous volcanoes, the threat and the escape are at least separable. The volcano is over here, the eruption comes from over here, and the roads lead away from it, over there. You can, in principle, run. The geometry of escape exists at Campi Flegrei because the hazard is seismic as much as it is volcanic, and because the population is so dense and the building stock so old and the infrastructure so vulnerable. The threat and the escape route are physically entangled. The same shaking that creates the need to flee is the shaking that can destroy the means of fleeing. You cannot cleanly separate the danger from the exit because the danger acts on the exit. That is the trap. And the May 21st earthquake, by being felt across the whole region, by cracking walls and dropping plaster and collapsing an old arch in Pozzuoli, was a small, vivid, real-world demonstration that the trap is not theoretical. The shaking reaches the roads. The shaking reaches the bridges. The shaking reaches everything, all at once, because it is an earthquake, and that is what earthquakes do. And consider the timeline against the human reality one more time. The seismic reinforcement of the critical evacuation routes is projected to take until at least the end of 2027. Set aside the near certainty that large infrastructure projects overrun their schedules. Take the optimistic date at face value. That still means a window of well over a year from the May 21st earthquake forward, during which the situation is exactly as exposed as it was on that morning. Over a year of the Caldera continuing to breathe, continuing to rise, continuing to produce earthquakes, while the roads that everyone would need remain in their current, unreinforced in places obstructed state. The May 21st earthquake did not just reveal a problem. It revealed a problem with a clock attached, a problem that will remain unsolved through every earthquake the Caldera produces between now and the end of 2027 at the earliest. And the people living there know it. They know the upgrade timeline. They know the roads are not ready. They know, when they feel the ground move at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, that if this had been the larger one, the means of their escape would not have been ready to carry them. That knowledge is not panic. It is arithmetic. It is the rational, sober reading of their own situation, and it is why a magnitude 4.4, a number that should be almost reassuringly small, instead landed on the city like a warning shot. That is the nightmare. Not a movie volcano. A cascade. An earthquake, then collapsed buildings, then blocked roads, then a failed evacuation, then mass panic across a metropolitan region of 6 million people, all trying to leave at once, along routes that are cratered and buried and broken. And here is why the May 21st earthquake mattered so much, why it was not just another tremor. The magnitude 4.4 on May 21st did not cause that cascade. Nothing collapsed onto the highways, the bridges held. But the earthquake was a live, public, terrifying rehearsal of the very first link in that chain. It was the city feeling, in its body, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, the exact sensation that begins the catastrophe. The shaking that, just a little stronger, becomes the rubble that blocks the road that traps the people. The people of Naples did not panic because they are fragile. They panicked because they understood correctly what they had just felt the leading edge of. And to understand just how deep that understanding runs, how it is almost written into the cultural memory of this place, we have to go back. Not years, centuries. Because Campi Flegrei has done this before, and the last time it built a brand new mountain in 8 days. Part 7. The Mountain Born in 8 Days. To understand why the people living on Campi Flegrei carry a specific ancestral kind of dread, you have to understand that this caldera has a track record, and the track record is written into the very ground they walk on. There is a place in Pozzuoli, an ancient Roman marketplace, that contains what might be the single most eloquent piece of physical evidence in all of volcanology. It is called the Temple of Serapis, though it was never actually a temple, it was a market hall, and standing in it are 3 tall marble columns, and those columns tell a story that no instrument and no scientist had to write down, because the volcano wrote it itself. If you look closely at those marble columns, you see partway up a distinct band, a zone of the marble that is pitted and bored full of small holes. Those holes were drilled by marine mollusks, by a kind of clam that bores into stone, and that clam can only do its work underwater, below sea level, while submerged in the sea. Which means the marble of those columns, at the height of that band, spent a long stretch of history underwater. The Roman market, built on dry land, sank. The ground subsided slowly century after century, until the bases of those columns and a good portion of their height were below the surface of the sea, and the boring clams moved in and did their patient work. And then, just as slowly the ground rose again, lifting the columns, lifting the boreholes, lifting the entire market back up into the air, where they stand today, dry, carrying that band of holes like a watermark left by a flood that lasted 1,000 years. By around the year 1000, the site had sunk roughly 11 meters below sea level, and then it rose roughly 12 meters back up. The columns are a tide gauge made of marble, and what they record is the breathing of the ground, bradycism, operating over the entire span of recorded history. This is not a new phenomenon. The caldera has always breathed. The people of Pozzuoli have always lived on a surface that rises and falls. But the columns also record something more specific and more frightening, because the last great rise, the 12 meters of uplift, did not end gently. It ended in fire. We need to talk about the year 1538 and a hill called Monte Nuovo, because that is the precedent that hangs over everything happening today. In the decades before 1538, the people living in the Campi Flegrei area would have recognized everything we have described in this video. The ground was rising, the uplift was accelerating. In the area near the coast where the disaster would eventually unfold, the ground was pushed upward on the order of several meters, and in the period immediately before the eruption, the uplift became rapid, around 4 to 4.5 meters of lift in a compressed span of time. The shoreline moved. The sea retreated as the land rose, displacing the coast by hundreds of meters. People at the time recorded the strangeness of it. New land emerging from the water, fish left stranding, the ground swelling like something alive. And then, over the course of roughly 8 days at the end of September 1538, the accelerating uplift gave way to eruption. The ground opened and a pyroclastic eruption began, and it built from nothing a brand new volcanic cone. They named it, with grim simplicity, Monte Nuovo, the new mountain, a hill that did not exist 1 week and existed the next, standing over 100 meters tall, made of the shattered rock and ash the eruption had thrown up around its own vent. A mountain born in roughly 8 days. Now I want to be careful and honest here, because the channel does not deal in cheap fear, and the 1538 comparison can be misused. The Monte Nuovo eruption was, by the standards of what Campi Flegrei is geologically capable of, a small eruption. This caldera, in its deep past, tens of thousands of years ago, produced colossal, civilization-scale eruptions, the kind that blanket continents in ash. Monte Nuovo was nothing like that. It was a modest event, and the difference matters because one of the false narratives we will address shortly is the idea that the caldera is about to produce its worst case, planet-altering eruption, which nothing in the data supports. So when we invoke 1538, We're not invoking the apocalypse. We are invoking something more specific, and in some ways more useful. We are invoking the pattern. Years of accelerating uplift, a rapid final surge, and then, at the end of it, an eruption that built a mountain in a week. That pattern is the template, and it is the template that the modern crisis keeps being measured against by scientists and by the public alike. I want to make sure the 1538 story is understood for what it really teaches, because the lesson is not the one people usually take from it. People hear that a mountain appeared in 8 days, and they take away a lesson about speed, about how fast an eruption can come, and that is part of it. But the deeper lesson of Monte Nuovo is about the years before the 8 days. The eruption itself was sudden. The setup was not. The setup was slow and visible and went on for a long time, and people at the time watched it happen, without knowing what they were watching. The ground rising, the coast retreating as the land lifted, the sea pulling back to expose new ground. Contemporary accounts describe these signs, describe the strangeness of them, describe people noticing that something was deeply wrong with the land. The uplift accelerated in the final stretch, that rapid 4 to 4.5 metre surge immediately before the vent opened. The pattern, in other words, was readable, in hindsight. Years of uplift, then a final acceleration, then eruption. And the reason that pattern is so heavy now is that the modern crisis rhymes with the first 2 beats of it. There has been uplift, sustained, for years. There have been periods of acceleration. The people living on the Caldera today are living inside a sequence that, on its first 2 beats, resembles the prelude to 1538. That is not a prediction. The resemblance is real, but it is not destiny. And most sequences of caldera unrest do not end in eruption. But it explains, better than anything, why the population reads a strong earthquake the way it does. They are not reading it against a blank background. They are reading it against Monte Nuovo, against a documented case where their own ground did exactly this prelude, and then built a mountain. And the marble columns, the Temple of Serapis, deserve one more thought, because of what they represent about time. Those bands of clam borings are the record of Bradycism operating across a scale of centuries, of the ground sinking 11 metres over many hundreds of years and then rising 12 metres back. What that tells you is that the breathing of this caldera is not a modern aberration, not something that started in the 1980s or the 2020s. It is the permanent condition of the place. The ground here has always moved. It has spent centuries going down and centuries coming back up, and the human settlements have ridden that motion the entire time, mostly without catastrophe. That is, in one sense, oddly reassuring. The caldera breathes, and most of the breathing is just breathing, not eruption. But in another sense it sharpens the unease, because it means the current uplift is not a strange new event that might simply stop and reverse harmlessly. It is the latest stretch of a process with a very long history, a process that, at least once in the documented record, in 1538, ended its upward phase not with a quiet reversal, but with fire. The columns prove the breathing is normal. Monte Nuovo proves the breathing can, at the end of a long inhale, turn into something else. And then there is the more recent precedent, the one inside living memory, the one that explains why the civil protection structures exist at all. In the early 1980s, between roughly 1982 and 1984, Campi Flegrei went through a Bradycism crisis that was traumatic, and I use that word deliberately, for the town of Pozzuoli. Over those 2 years, the ground rose by about 1.8 metres, and the caldera generated more than 16,000 earthquakes. 16,000 in 2 years. The strongest of them reached a local magnitude of around 4.0 in October of 1983. Earthquakes strong enough to crack buildings, again and again, while the ground kept rising underneath everyone. And the crisis was severe enough, and the resemblance to the lead-up to past eruptions unsettling enough, that the Italian government made an extraordinary decision. They permanently relocated around 40,000 residents of Pozzuoli, moving them to a brand new town, built for the purpose, on higher and safer ground. They called the new town Monteruscello. 40,000 people moved off the volcano because the ground would not stop rising and the rock would not stop breaking. There is a detail in the 1980s relocation that I find genuinely haunting, and it speaks directly to the situation today. When the Italian government moved roughly 40,000 people out of Pozzuoli and built them the new town of Monteruscello on higher and safer ground, it was an enormous, expensive, disruptive act of preventive caution. It was the state looking at a Bradycism crisis, recognizing the resemblance to dangerous precedents, and choosing to physically remove a large population from harm's way before anything catastrophic happened. And here is the haunting part. Over the decades since, as the crisis of the early 80s faded into memory and the ground stopped its alarming rise, people drifted back. The red zone did not stay emptied. Life and economics and the deep human attachment to a place pulled the population back onto the dangerous ground. The relocation was real, and at the time it was decisive, and yet the long quiet that followed undid much of it, because a quiet volcano does not feel like a reason to stay away. That is the pattern the experts are fighting now when they beg for a gradual permanent depopulation. They are fighting not just the difficulty of moving people, but the much deeper difficulty of keeping ground empty once the volcano goes quiet again, and it tells you something sobering about the present moment. The May 21st earthquake and the loud crisis of 2025 before it are the volcano being unquiet, being impossible to ignore. The grim irony is that the periods when people are most willing to take the hazard seriously are precisely the periods when the hazard is most active, and the periods when depopulation would be easiest to sustain. The long quiet stretches are precisely the periods when no one feels the urgency to do it. That history is why the reaction to May 21st cannot be understood as simple overreaction. The people of the Phlegreian fields are not reacting to one earthquake. They are reacting through layers. They carry the marble columns and their 1,000-year tide mark. They carry 1538 and the mountain that rose in 8 days at the end of an uplift that looked like theirs. They carry, for the older among them, the personal memory of 16,000 earthquakes and a forced exodus, and a whole new town built to receive them. And they carry the knowledge, fresh from 2025, that this caldera can still produce its strongest shaking in 40 years. When a magnitude 4.4 arrives on top of all of that, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, from a strange direction, followed by silence, it does not land as an isolated event. It lands as the latest entry in a very long, very personal ledger of a volcano that has never really let this place forget what it is. So when you ask why the people of Naples reacted to a magnitude 4.4 with something close to panic, here is a large part of the answer. They are not reacting only to the shock of May 21st, 2026. They are reacting through a memory. A cultural generational memory that includes a band of clamholes on a marble column proving the ground has drowned and resurfaced before, that includes a mountain that appeared in 8 days in 1538, at the end of exactly the kind of uplift they are living through now, and that includes the lived experience, for the older residents, of 16,000 earthquakes and a forced exodus of 40,000 of their neighbours within the last lifetime. The May 21st earthquake did not land on a blank slate. It landed on a population that knows, in its bones, what this caldera has done before. And that knowledge is why the next thing that happened, the silence, the absence of official information, hit so hard. Because a people this primed, this aware, this historically literate about their own volcano, are exactly the people who go straight to the data the instant the ground moves, and on May 21st the data was not there. Part 8. The Silence and the Cascade. We need to return now to that window of silence on the morning of May 21st, because it is where two threads of this story braid together. The first thread is everything we have built so far: the offshore earthquake, the breathing ground, the fragile city, the failed evacuation plan, the long memory. The second thread is something we have only touched on, which is the question of trust. What people believe about the institutions watching over them, and the silence is where trust either holds or breaks. Recall the situation. A magnitude 4.4 earthquake, shallow, felt by millions, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning. And then, for a meaningful stretch of time, nothing on the public earthquake databases. Nothing from the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology's public-facing pages. Nothing on the international monitoring sites. A whole region, awake and frightened, refreshing their screens and finding a blank where the answer should be. We have already given the honest, grounded explanation for why that happens. Locating and sizing a fresh earthquake takes processing time. Preliminary solutions are rough and get revised. The United States Geological Survey's first cut at this very earthquake put it in the wrong spot at the wrong size, around 4.1, before the numbers were corrected. None of that is sinister. All of it is just the ordinary, messy reality of how seismology works in the first minutes after an event. But here is what I want to say clearly, because it is the honest thing to say. Understanding why the silence happened does not undo the damage the silence did. When the people who feel the catastrophe cannot, for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or however long it stretched, get a single authoritative word about what just happened to them, that silence does real harm. It is, functionally, part of the earthquake's impact. And it does something else, something corrosive. It opens a door into the vacuum where official information should have been. Other explanations rush in, and the most powerful of those, the one that always circulates after a strong earthquake at Campi Flegrei, is the suspicion that the silence was not a technical lag at all, that the authorities, the scientists, knew exactly what had happened, knew it was bad, and deliberately withheld it to keep the population calm, to prevent panic. I want to engage that idea directly and respectfully, because the people who feel it are not stupid and they are not paranoid for nothing. They are people who are shaken awake and then met with silence, and the human mind, faced with silence in a moment of fear, fills it. But let me walk through what the evidence actually supports. The deliberate cover-up explanation requires the institutions to have a coordinated, functioning capability to suppress earthquake data across multiple independent agencies, including international ones with no connection to Italian politics, like the United States Geological Survey. The USGS published a preliminary, and wrong, location and magnitude for this event. That is not what a cover-up looks like. That is what an honest, imperfect, automatic processing pipeline looks like. A cover-up does not publish a wrong answer. A cover-up publishes nothing, or it publishes a soothing answer. The blurry, self-correcting, internally inconsistent way the data actually emerged on May 21st is, paradoxically, the strongest evidence that no one was managing it. It was not suppressed. It was just slow and messy and human. But, and this is the fair part, the criticism underneath the conspiracy theory is legitimate. It is completely fair to say that a region living under this much volcanic stress deserves faster, clearer public communication. It is fair to say that the gap between the monitoring agency's real-time internal data and what the public could see was too wide on May 21st. The conspiracy framing, that the silence was a deliberate deception, is not supported. But the underlying complaint, that the communication failed the people it was supposed to serve, is supported, and the authorities would do well to hear it. The lesson of the silence is not that anyone lied. The lesson is that, on the morning of a real event, the system that is supposed to inform a frightened population did not inform them fast enough, and into that gap flowed fear and rumour. Fix the speed, and you starve the conspiracy. I want to add one more layer to the silence, because there is a structural reason it happened that is worth understanding, and understanding it is the antidote to the conspiracy reading. There is a real tension, built into the job of any volcano monitoring agency, between speed and accuracy. The instant an earthquake happens, automatic systems can generate a first estimate of its location and magnitude within seconds. But that first automatic estimate is by its nature rough. It is based on incomplete data, the first stations to register the waves, and it has not yet been checked by a human analyst. The agency then faces a genuine dilemma. Do they publish the fast, rough, possibly wrong number immediately? Or do they wait the extra minutes for a human seismologist to review the data, refine the location, settle the magnitude, and publish something they are confident in? Publish fast and you risk putting out a wrong number that then has to be corrected, which itself can cause confusion and ironically fuel mistrust. Publish carefully and you leave a frightened public in the dark for longer. There is no perfect answer to that dilemma. Every monitoring agency in the world wrestles with it. The United States Geological Survey, on May 21st, leaned towards speed and published a preliminary number, around 4.1, in a slightly wrong location, and then revised it. The Italian agency's public pipeline, for whatever combination of reasons, was slower to surface the event. Neither choice is corruption. Both are just different points on the unavoidable trade-off between fast and right. But here is the thing the agencies have to reckon with, and the legitimate criticism that the May 21st silence sharpens. In the modern world, the public does not actually wait in silence. The public has the internet. And if the official, authoritative source is silent for 20 or 30 minutes, the public does not experience that as silence. They experience it as a space, and that space fills instantly with something. It fills with rumour, with speculation, with frightened people in group chats comparing notes, with half-remembered facts and confident misinformation, and, yes, with conspiracy theories. The vacuum is never actually empty. It is always filled by whatever rushes in fastest, and what rushes in fastest is rarely accurate and rarely calming. So the real lesson for the monitoring agencies is not that they did something corrupt. It is that, in an environment where the vacuum will be filled no matter what, the cost of being slow has gone up. Every minute the official source is silent is a minute donated to the rumour. That is a hard operational problem, and it is a fair criticism, and it has nothing to do with anyone hiding anything. The fix is not to expose a conspiracy. The fix is to get faster and clearer, and to communicate uncertainty honestly, to be willing to say we felt it too, we are working on the numbers, here is what we know and here is what we do not know yet. A frightened population can handle uncertainty. What it cannot handle is silence, because silence it will fill itself, and it will fill it badly. And there is a deeper point underneath all of this, about why the conspiracy theories find such ready soil at Campi Flegrei specifically. It is not because the people there are unusually credulous. It is because they are in a genuinely difficult position with respect to trust. They are being asked by the authorities to do two contradictory things at once. They are being asked to stay, to live their lives, to send their kids to school, to keep the economy and the community functioning, on the grounds that an eruption is not imminent. And they are simultaneously being asked to take the hazard seriously, to know their evacuation zone, to participate in drills, to be ready to flee, stay calm and be ready to run. Those two messages are both correct, and they are both necessary, and they are also psychologically very hard to hold at the same time. When an institution asks you to hold two contradictory postures, any crack in that institution's communication, any silence, any delay, any revised number, gets read through the suspicion that one of the two messages is the lie, that is the soil. It is not stupidity. It is the natural strain of being asked to live calmly on top of something you're also told to fear. And it is one more reason that fast, transparent, honest communication is not a nicety at Campi Flegrei. It is structural. It is load-bearing. There are two other narratives that always circulate, and they deserve the same direct treatment. The first is the idea that this earthquake means the supervolcano is waking up to produce a caldera-forming, civilization-ending eruption. We addressed the seed of this in the last part, but it bears stating flatly. Campi Flegrei producing a small eruption, a Monte Nuovo scale event, is a real possibility that the science takes seriously. Campi Flegrei producing one of its colossal, deep past, continent-dusting super eruptions is an entirely different and astronomically rarer category of event, and nothing in the current data points toward it. A restless caldera is not a caldera on the verge of its worst case. Conflating those two things is the single most common error in how this volcano gets discussed, and we are not going to make it. The second is the question, raised constantly and with real frustration, of why people are still allowed to live in and even move into the red zone, if the scientists genuinely consider the danger this severe. And here I want to be clear that this is not really a conspiracy theory at all. It is a legitimate, painful, unresolved policy failure, and it deserves to be named as one. Volcanologists have argued for years that the red zone should be gradually depopulated. The specific, sensible proposal that experts have begged for is not a dramatic forced evacuation. It is something quieter. Stop allowing new residents to move in. When someone leaves a red zone home, do not let it be reoccupied. Retire it. Turn vacated land back into something else, into parkland. Slowly, over a generation, reduce the number of human beings living directly on top of the most dangerous part of the volcano. That this has not happened is not evidence of a hidden agenda. It is evidence of how brutally hard it is, socially, economically, politically, to move people off land their families have held for generations, to tell someone their neighbourhood is being wound down. But the fact that it is hard does not make it less of a failure. People are living and sleeping and raising children directly on top of an active caldera's most hazardous ground, and the slow, humane depopulation that the scientists have asked for has not been delivered. That is true, and the May 21st earthquake made it true in a way that was suddenly very loud. So let us assemble the full cascade, the complete chain of risk, because this is the argument the entire video has been building toward. It begins with an earthquake, not an eruption. An earthquake, like the one on May 21st, except imagine it a little stronger, into that magnitude 5 range the structural engineers warn about. That earthquake strikes the old, unreinforced, in places powdered masonry of Naples and the Phlegreian towns, and a significant number of buildings fail. Those failures produce casualties directly, and they produce rubble. The rubble falls into the streets, onto the roads, and potentially brings down the bridges and overpasses and columns along the highways. The same roads and bridges that have not been seismically upgraded, that will not be upgraded until the end of 2027 at the earliest, that are in places already obstructed by construction. With the arteries blocked, the evacuation plan, the one that experts already doubt, the one whose rehearsals almost nobody attended, becomes physically impossible to execute. And now you have hundreds of thousands of people, maybe far more once the panic spreads beyond the official red zone into the wider city of 6 million, all trying to flee at once, along routes that are cratered and buried and broken. That is the catastrophe. And notice that, in that entire chain, the volcano barely had to do anything. It did not have to erupt. It just had to shake hard enough once to start the dominoes. The earthquake that creates the emergency is the same earthquake that destroys the means of escaping it. That is what the people of Naples felt the leading edge of at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning on May 21st. Not a volcano, the first domino. Part 9. The direction. No one was watching. We have one thread left to pull, and it is the one I asked you back near the start to keep holding. It is the strangest feature of the May 21st earthquake, and it is, I think, the real core of this entire story. The earthquake came from the water. It came from offshore. And it was not the first time. Let me lay the pattern out one more time, cleanly, because I want you to feel the weight of it. Campi Flegrei's seismicity, the everyday rattle of it, is overwhelmingly an on-land phenomenon. It clusters under Pozzuoli, under the Solfatara, around Agnano, in the central core of the Caldera. That central core is the most studied part of the system. It is the most densely instrumented part. It is where the deformation is greatest and where the scientific understanding is deepest. If you had asked before all this where the strong earthquakes of the modern crisis would come from, the answer would have been from there, from the on-land core. But look at the two largest events of the entire modern crisis. The magnitude 4.6 of June 30th, 2025, the strongest earthquake at this caldera in roughly 40 years, offshore, in the water near Pozzuoli, and now the magnitude 4.4 of May 21st, 2026, the strongest of this year and among the strongest of the whole crisis, also offshore, also out in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, near Pozzuoli, near Monte Nuovo. The two biggest punches this volcano has thrown in the modern era did not come from the part of the caldera everyone is watching. They came from the submarine western flank. I have been careful, all the way through this video, not to overstate what two data points can mean, and I am going to stay careful now. Two events is not a confirmed trend. It is entirely possible that this is coincidence, that the next big earthquake comes from the on-land core and the offshore pattern dissolves into noise. A responsible reading does not declare that the strain has migrated. But a responsible reading absolutely does ask the question, and the question is genuinely unsettling. What if the most energetic strain release of this crisis is shifting, away from the on-land core and out under the sea? Because the offshore western sector of the caldera is, by the nature of working underwater, harder to instrument. It is harder to cover with the dense network of sensors that blankets the land. It is, in a real sense, the part of the volcano that scientists can see least clearly, and if the biggest earthquakes are now coming from the part of the volcano that is hardest to watch, then the monitoring system, as good as it is, may be best at watching the area where the action is no longer concentrated. And the offshore location carries one more consequence, the one I flagged early and promised to return to. If the strong events are migrating into the water, then the kinds of volcanic activity that can occur underwater become part of the threat picture in a way they would not be for an on-land event. Specifically, if a phreatic explosion, a steam-driven blast, were to occur not under a town but under the seafloor of the Gulf of Pozzuoli, it could displace water. And water displaced suddenly is the mechanism of a tsunami. I want to be precise and not alarmist about this. This is a low probability scenario. It is not a forecast. It is a physically real pathway that exists specifically because the recent strong earthquakes have been offshore. Submarine explosive activity generating local waves is a recognized hazard at coastal volcanic systems around the world, and the Gulf of Pozzuoli opens directly onto the coastline of one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas in Europe. The offshore location of the May 21st earthquake is what moves that pathway from irrelevant to worth naming. It is one more reason the direction this earthquake came from matters as much as its size. Let me also be honest about the limits of what monitoring can do for the offshore problem, because this is where the unease is most legitimate. The land-based network at Campi Flegrei is genuinely excellent. Seismometers, GPS stations measuring the ground's rise to the millimetre, gravimeters, gas sensors at the solfatara, instruments tracking the chemistry and temperature of the groundwater. On land, the Caldera is one of the most thoroughly watched volcanic systems on the planet. But the sea is a different problem. Instrumenting a seafloor is harder, more expensive, and more fragile than instrumenting dry land. Sensors underwater are difficult to install, difficult to power, difficult to maintain, difficult to recover when they fail. The dense, redundant coverage that blankets the on-land caldera simply cannot be reproduced as easily under the Gulf of Pozzuoli. This does not mean the offshore sector is unwatched. It means it is watched less densely, with less redundancy, than the core. And if the pattern of the last two big earthquakes is real, if the strongest strain release genuinely is favouring the submarine western flank, then the system is producing its largest events in the sector where the monitoring is thinnest. That is not conspiracy, and it is not negligence. It is a hard physical constraint of working underwater, but it is a real gap, and it is the gap that the May 21st earthquake, coming from the water, quietly pointed at. And there is a reason the phreatic eruption scenario in the offshore migration interlocks so uncomfortably, a reason worth stating plainly before we close. A phreatic eruption, remember, is the type that can come with little or no warning, because it does not require the slow, detectable ascent of magma. It only requires heat to meet water and flash it to steam fast enough to shatter rock. Now, place that under the sea. The offshore sector has, by definition, an effectively unlimited supply of water sitting directly above it. It is the sector where the monitoring is thinnest, so the subtle precursors, if there even are any, are hardest to catch. And it is the sector that, if it produced a sudden steam-driven explosion, could displace seawater and send a wave toward a coastline lined with millions of people. Each of those facts alone is manageable. Stacked together, they describe the specific corner of the whole Campi Flegrei problem, where the warning is least likely to come, the hazard is hardest to see, and the consequence reaches the most people. I am not telling you that is going to happen. The probability of that specific scenario is low, and no agency is forecasting it. I am telling you that the offshore direction of the May 21st earthquake is what draws a line connecting those three facts, and that the line, once you have seen it, is hard to unsee. So let us land this. Let us bring every thread together, because the picture they form, assembled, is the answer to the question we started with. Why did a moderate earthquake send a country into panic? It sent a country into panic because the earthquake was never really the story. The earthquake was the messenger. The story is everything the earthquake revealed, in 60 seconds of shaking, at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning. It revealed that the strongest shocks of this crisis are now coming from an offshore direction that is harder to monitor, and that opens a pathway, however slim, to water displacement. It revealed that the ground beneath Naples is in a years-long accelerating phase of breathing, of bradyseism, that has lifted the centre of Pozzuoli by nearly 5 feet, and that the unrest, while assessed as hydrothermal rather than magmatic, is intimately connected to the one kind of eruption, the phreatic, steam-driven kind that can arrive with no warning at all. It revealed that the city sitting on this volcano is, in large part, built of old, unreinforced masonry, some of it so degraded that buildings lean on their neighbours to stay upright, and that structural engineers use the language of mass casualties when they describe what a magnitude 5.1 would do to it. It revealed that the evacuation plan, the supposed safety net, is doubted by the very scientists who understand the hazard, was rehearsed to near-empty participation, and depends on roads and bridges that will not be seismically reinforced for years and are in places already blocked. And it revealed that when the moment came, when millions of frightened people reached for the official word, there was, for a while, only silence. None of those things on their own is the catastrophe, but assembled they are a portrait of a place where the margin for error has worn dangerously thin. And the people who live there understood that portrait instantly, in their bodies, the moment the ground moved. They were not panicking about a 4.4, they were panicking about the cascade the 4.4 is a rehearsal for. The earthquake, then the fragile buildings, then the blocked roads, then the failed evacuation, then 6 million people, and nowhere to go. Here is the thought I want to leave you with, the one that I cannot stop turning over. The people of Naples did everything right on the morning of May 21st. They have lived with this volcano their whole lives. They know its history, the marble columns, the mountain born in 8 days, the 16,000 earthquakes and the 40,000 neighbours relocated. They have been trained, and they train themselves to go straight to the data the instant the ground moves. They are, in a sense, the best prepared volcanic population on Earth, the most literate about their own danger. And on the morning of May 21st, this best prepared population woke up to a violent shock from a direction no one was fully watching, and reached for the answer, and for a long dark stretch of time found nothing waiting for them. The system was briefly silent. Even the experts needed time to speak. So the question that the May 21st earthquake leaves hanging over the Gulf of Naples is not really whether the volcano will erupt. It is quieter and colder and harder to answer than that. If the caldera can shake that hard, from a direction the instruments cover least well, and leave even the people whose job is to watch it briefly without an answer, then what happens on the day the warning everyone is counting on, the warning the whole plan depends on, the warning that a steam-driven eruption may never send in the first place simply does not come? The ground under Naples is still breathing. It is still rising, and the next time it speaks, the only thing anyone can say for certain is that millions of people will be listening in the dark, waiting for someone to tell them what it meant.